Sarah Aziz, 3 Lancelot Drive. I have a copy of former Acting Superintendent Robert Goodall's contract. It includes an end date, it mentions the word consideration, it requires an evaluation, unlike Ms. Chanley's contract, and there's no excuse for not establishing district goals. That said, on May 13th, the board sent, in the May 13th letter to the board granting the extension of Ms. Chanley's contract, the Commissioner of Education said that the state, quote unquote, may grant approval for a non-certificated staff member to serve as district superintendent for up to 3 months at a time, end quote. Please note that the Commissioner appears to consider Ms. Chanley to be, quote unquote, non-certificate in the sense that she does not have a standard certificate. She said that she granted the first extension with the expectation that the district would have a permanent full-time superintendent in place by May 10th. She also indicated that since she granted the first extension, several members of the public have contacted her office and the governor's office to express concerns about Ms. Chanley. The Commissioner granted this extension subject to several conditions. Specifically, for the first time in history, the Commissioner of Education required our board to prove that it's conducting a good faith search for a qualified permanent superintendent by requiring the board president to report the status of the search to the county superintendent, Kyle Anderson, on a bi-weekly basis. This shows that the state does not trust the board. It is quite clear from reading this letter that the Commissioner wants the board to find another permanent superintendent besides Ms. Chanley. Otherwise, she would have enthusiastically approved this contract extension with no condition. She specifically writes, the board shall nominate and have a signed contract with a new full-time superintendent within the timeline of the NJSBA search process. It appears that the Commissioner does not consider Ms. Chanley to be a viable candidate for permanent superintendent because she is not certificate, and therefore her contract requires reapproval every 3 months. It is my belief that it was the board's intention to keep extending Ms. Chanley's contract until she earned the standard school administrator certificate, at which point the board would appoint her permanent superintendent. However, the outcry from the community has stymied this plan. A newspaper article published on June 8th indicated that a lawsuit has been filed against the Monroe Township Board of Education seeking to invalidate the vote to extend Ms. Chanley's contract. The lawsuit alleges Ms. Skirby, Mr. Chiarella, and Mr. Nikotinsky have conflicts of interest with respect to Ms. Chanley, as well as Ms. Berman. In addition, the lawsuit alleges that Mr. Nikotinsky is doubly conflicted because his businesses, Dot Designing and Orange Media Group, profited from the actions of Ms. Chanley when she was principal of the middle school. On June 10th, Ms. Skirby wrote a letter to Kyle Anderson updating him on the status of the board's search. In this letter, Ms. Chanley said the board had narrowed its search down to 5 finalists, which included Ms. Chanley, but the letter said nothing about the results of the superintendent survey. Instead, it included an attack on fellow board member Katie Fabiano and her husband, Brian Fabiano, who is a private citizen. This letter stated that Ms. Fabiano was too conflicted to participate in the superintendent search as long as Ms. Chanley was a viable candidate because Mr. Fabiano is a vocal critic of Ms. Chanley. The letter also defamed Mr. Fabiano when it accused him of spreading false information about Ms. Chanley on a social media page, quote unquote, run by Sarah Aziz. Given that the Commissioner said that Ms. Chanley's contracts must be reapproved every 3 months, she cannot be a viable candidate for permanent superintendent. In my view, Ms. Fabiano is not conflicted due to her husband's actions. And interestingly, Ms. Skirby never claimed that Ms. Fabiano was conflicted when her husband was advocating in favor of Ms. Chanley as recently as January 2022. But now that Mr. Fabiano believes that Ms. Chanley is a poor choice for permanent superintendent, Ms. Skirby appears to be determined to silence his wife. The June 10th letter to Mr. Anderson represents an abuse of power.
Mr. Gagliardi? And
okay.
I'm just repeating the language from the Commissioner. This is what the Commissioner said.
Yeah, I'm well aware of that. Okay, so the language, again, because I don't want the public to get the misimpression, at least as far as Mr. and Mrs. Fabiano are concerned. That language that you read from the letter that said Mrs. Fabiano should not participate so long as Mrs. Chanley was a candidate comes directly from school boards, which is handling the search. So that was not defamatory language cooked up in a secret laboratory
I didn't
somewhere.
say that was the defamatory language. I was referring to the comments about Mr. Fabiano.
I'm just going to, let me finish. So that was simply a recitation of what school boards had advised the board in terms of reporting on the process.
Have they advised about the other board members?
So neither those board members nor anyone of which I'm aware has found those board members to be in conflict. So there's no reason to mention that. As far as the certificate issue is concerned, another issue we've covered many times. So in order for the board to have considered someone for the permanent position, and I honestly don't know who submitted applications or who the candidates are, so this is as general as it can be. In order to have that permanent certificate, you would either have to be someone who has been or is a superintendent, or has been or is an assistant superintendent. So.
Or a director, right?
Good grief. So all of the school districts in the state operate under the same set of rules. And so if you have someone who is either an acting superintendent or is going to be appointed superintendent who doesn't have one of those certificates, the State Department of Education uses the phraseology substandard certificate. It's not a lesser certificate or a suggestion that the people are not qualified. It's just they don't have that certificate. You have to be in the position and you have to be mentored in order to achieve that certificate. And so whether someone is going to be an acting superintendent or a permanent superintendent, that's the phraseology that the Department of Education uses. And the fact that it takes time to do that, it takes about a year under any
I'm only
circumstances.
referring to the language that the commissioner used.
I understand what you're
Okay.
referring to, and I'm trying to,
I understand.
board president's direction, respond to your questions, and also to inform the public. The only other thing that I think should be mentioned is the idea that this is being done in 90-day increments, and that after you get an extension, that is the further 90 days, the board has to report on the status of the search. Absolute standard fare. And I don't necessarily want to reveal privileged communications, but I think the board president will acknowledge that the course of action taken by the Department of Education was specifically predicted by me because I've seen this so many times. It is very difficult to complete the search within 90 days. If you don't, you need to ask for an extension. The letter that you are holding up there also talks about what it was needed to get even a further extension. You didn't mention that, and it's the same thing. The department doesn't want to see you continually replacing the chief school administrator, but they insist that you be making progress to finding someone permanent. And so I expected the board would be asked to do that. It was asked to do that. I'm not offended or troubled by the fact that they asked for interim reports now that we're on a second extension. And I think the board would have to show good reason if it needed a further extension, but the letter you're holding up there does not forbid that either. It wants, the Department of Education wants to see the board move toward a permanent superintendent, and this is standard fare.